The wind chimes are singing tonight. Do you hear them? Sara's last gift, oxidized green now, making music from broken things. I've been sitting here in this old garden since before you arrived, watching the evening twilight paint these azaleas purple in the fading light. The willow tree beside me has grown wild these past 5 years, its branches trailing into the small pond like fingers testing water temperature. You know, grief changes how we see time. These summer evenings stretch differently now, each one carrying the weight of all the evenings before. But tonight feels particular somehow. Perhaps it's the way the light catches the water, or how the breeze moves through these ancient oaks with such gentleness. I find myself thinking of Mark again, a dear friend who visited this very spot 3 seasons ago. His face drawn tight with the kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. He was 52 then, successful by any measure society offers. Corner office, beautiful home, children who called regularly. Yet he carried himself like a man bearing invisible stones. I cannot silence my mind, he told me as we walked these same garden paths. The thoughts never stop. Regrets, mostly. All the choices I should have made differently. His words hung in the air like incense, heavy with years of accumulated worry. Mark had discovered what so many of us learn in midlife, that success measured in external achievements can leave the heart surprisingly empty. He spoke of promotion opportunities declined out of fear. Relationships ended too quickly. Words left unspoken to his father before the old man died. Each memory seemed to pierce him anew, fresh as the day it happened. Even at night, he whispered, settling onto this same stone bench where I sit now, my mind churns like a washing machine. 3, 4 in the morning, and I'm rehearsing conversations from 20 years ago, rewriting scenes that can never change. The moonlight caught the silver at his temples, and I saw how deeply fatigue had etched itself around his eyes. I remember leading him to stand beneath this willow tree that night, its trailing branches creating a natural sanctuary around us. The pond reflected broken pieces of moon, each ripple fragmenting the light into countless dancing stars. "Watch the leaves," I suggested quietly. "See how they move." Above us, the willow's summer foliage swayed in the gentle evening breeze, each leaf responding to currents invisible to us. Some leaves danced vigorously while others barely stirred. Some held tight to their branches, while others, the older ones, browning at the edges, released themselves to float down toward the water's surface. "The tree doesn't instruct each leaf how to move," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't grasp desperately when autumn comes. Each leaf follows its own nature, its own time. When readiness arrives, letting go happens naturally." Mark watched one particular leaf spiral downward, landing on the pond's surface where it floated serenely among the lily pads. But my thoughts, they feel so solid, so real. The regret about not taking that job in San Francisco, the marriage I ended too quickly, the way I spoke to my daughter last week. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. This is when the Buddha's wisdom becomes most practical, most immediate. Not in the meditation halls or the scripture study, but here beneath a willow tree, watching a grown man's heart break open with the accumulated weight of choices that cannot be undone. I've seen this moment thousands of times in 30 years of practice. The instant when someone realizes that suffering isn't caused by our circumstances, but by our relationship to our circumstances. Just as leaves drift freely, I said, reaching up to touch a low-hanging branch. Let each worry fall. Let calmness arise naturally with gentle breathing. The words weren't instructions, but an invitation. The way you might invite someone to notice the warmth of sunlight on their skin. Mark's shoulders, which had been carved from tension for months, began to soften almost imperceptibly. I guided him to place his hand on his chest, to feel the rise and fall that had been sustaining him all these years without his conscious attention. The breath knows how to breathe, I said. The heart knows how to beat. Perhaps the mind knows how to find peace too, when we stop demanding it perform impossibly. We stood there for what might have been minutes or hours. Time moves differently in spaces of deep listening. Gradually, something shifted in Mark's face. The tight lines around his eyes began to ease. His breathing, which had been shallow and quick, found a deeper rhythm. As he learned to rest his attention on the sensation of breath entering and leaving his body, the churning thoughts that had tormented him began to settle like sediment in still water. I can feel spaces, he said with wonder, between thoughts. I never noticed them before. This is always the miracle. Not that thoughts disappear, but that we discover the vast sky in which they arise and pass away. Mark breathed, let thoughts subside, discovered present moment relief that had been available to him all along, hidden beneath the noise of constant mental commentary. Modern neuroscience has found what Buddhist practitioners have known for centuries, that our brains possess remarkable plasticity, constantly rewiring themselves based on where we place our attention. When Mark learned to rest his awareness on the breath rather than on his spinning thoughts, he was literally reshaping the neural pathways that had kept him trapped in cycles of regret and worry. The body holds wisdom our thinking minds often miss. As Mark continued breathing beneath the willow tree, I watched his nervous system begin to shift from the hypervigilance that had become his default state into something approaching ease. His jaw unclenched, his shoulders dropped, the rapid flutter of his eyelids, a sign of mind racing, gradually stilled. I remember my own teacher, Ajahn Chah, telling me decades ago that meditation isn't about stopping thoughts any more than a river is about stopping water. Let the mind be like sky, he would say, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. Clouds come and go, but sky remains unchanged. This was the gift Mark began to unwrap that evening. Not the absence of difficult thoughts, but a different relationship with them. Buddhism teaches us that the first arrow of pain, loss, disappointment, the simple fact of being human, is unavoidable. But the second arrow, our stories about what that pain means, our judgments about our judgments, our regrets about our regrets, this we add ourselves. Mark had been shooting himself with second arrows for years, each regret spawning new regrets, each worry generating fresh anxieties about being anxious. When I lost Sara 5 years ago, I discovered this teaching in my bones. The grief itself was clean, sharp, undeniable, a first arrow to the heart that came with loving deeply. But the stories I told myself about that grief, that I should be over it by now, that I had failed her somehow, that I was too old to start again. These were second arrows, self-inflicted wounds that prolonged suffering unnecessarily. Perhaps tonight you might try what Mark discovered beneath the willow tree. Find a comfortable position where your body can rest fully. Feel each breath soften as the body eases gently into rest. Begin where your head meets the pillow, noticing any tension held in your scalp, your forehead, the small muscles around your eyes. You're not trying to change anything, simply acknowledging what's present with the same gentle attention you might offer a sleeping child. Let your awareness travel down through your face, your jaw, your neck, places where worry often takes up residence. If you discover tightness, breathe into those spaces as if your breath were warm honey, sweet and soothing. Move slowly down through your shoulders, arms, chest, allowing each part of your body to release into gravity's embrace. Notice your breathing without trying to control it. In Buddhist practice, we call this mindfulness of breathing. Not breathing mindfully, but simply being aware of the breath that's already happening. Watch how each inhale naturally gives way to exhale, each exhale creating space for the next inhale. Like the willow leaves dancing in evening breeze, your breath has its own rhythm, its own wisdom. When thoughts arise, and they will, as naturally as leaves falling from trees, meet them with the same gentle acceptance you might offer a friend sharing their troubles. You don't need to solve every problem, understand every feeling, or fix every regret before you're allowed to rest. Just as leaves drift freely, let each worry fall. Let calmness arise naturally with gentle breathing. Mark returns to this garden sometimes, usually during difficult periods when old patterns of worry try to reassert themselves. Last month, he told me that he's learned to recognize what he calls the willow feeling. That sense of allowing thoughts and feelings to move through him without getting caught in their stories. I still have regrets, he said, but they don't have me. The wind chimes are growing quieter now as the evening breeze settles into stillness. Sara always said they sounded like prayers being whispered to the sky. Tonight I hear them differently, not as prayers requesting something, but as gratitude for what's already here. This moment, this breath, this opportunity to begin again, always beginning again, with the fresh possibility that arrives with each exhale. As the night deepens and the first stars appear above our garden sanctuary, another voice joins our circle of contemplation. Sometimes wisdom comes through the weathered words of old teachers, and sometimes through the bright clarity of younger hearts who've learned to dance with difficulty in their own ways. Feel where your shoulders hold the memory of striving, that familiar tension that speaks of decades spent leaning forward into tomorrow, while yesterday's choices whisper their persistent questions. I know this landscape intimately. 23 years ago, I sat in a corner office 40 floors above Manhattan, my shoulders carved from granite, my breath shallow as a trader's promise, believing that success meant never looking back and never slowing down. The gentle breeze that now moves through my awareness was then nothing more than conditioned air cycling through sealed windows, and I had forgotten that breathing could be anything other than fuel for the next deal, the next quarter, the next rung up a ladder that seemed to stretch into a sky I never had time to notice. But bodies remember what minds try to forget, and as you settle into this moment, let your breath find its own rhythm. like a lantern flame that needs no forcing to illuminate the darkness. There's wisdom in fatigue, though we rarely pause long enough to hear its teaching. When Emma discovered this truth, she was standing in her mother's kitchen at 3 a.m, the weight of caregiving pressed against her ribs, like a memory of all the ways we learn to carry what we cannot put down. Emma had been measuring her days in pill schedules and doctor appointments for 8 months when the gentle breeze first found her through her mother's open window, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and the sound of wind chimes her father had hung 30 years ago. She'd been reaching for her mother's water glass, her own reflection caught in the kitchen window. 47 years old, hair pulled back in the same efficient ponytail she'd worn since her consulting days, before the layoffs, before the pivot to freelancing, before her mother's diagnosis made every choice feel like choosing between drowning and letting someone else slip beneath the surface. "I'm not doing enough," she whispered to her reflection, the words carrying the weight of every caregiver who has ever stood in a darkened kitchen, questioning whether love can be measured and finding themselves wanting. The gentle breeze stirred the curtains, and for a moment, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The sensation of being held by something larger than her own effort. In my corporate days, I used to think exhaustion was a performance metric, proof that I was maximizing my human capital, optimizing my output, leveraging my capabilities. I measured worth in billable hours and carried fatigue like a badge of honor, never understanding that what I called success was actually a sophisticated form of spiritual bankruptcy. The merger that finally broke me, not the deal itself, but the realization that I had spent 2 decades building someone else's empire, while my own soul withered like a plant kept too far from the window, came just as my own mother began forgetting my name. The gentle breeze that flows through Emma's story is the same wind that found me in that hotel room in Phoenix, staring at my laptop screen at 2 a.m, trying to calculate the ROI on a life that felt increasingly like a company I no longer wanted to own. But Emma's path to understanding moved through different terrain, shaped by the particular geography of midlife reckoning that comes when our choices narrow to caring for those who once cared for us. Emma's mother, Margaret, had been a literature professor before retirement, and their house still held the archaeology of a life spent with books. As Emma helped her mother navigate the confusion that arrived each morning like an unwelcome visitor, she found herself rediscovering volumes she'd ignored during her achievement-oriented 20s and 30s. It was while searching for her mother's reading glasses that Emma discovered the slim volume of Buddhist stories wedged between a cookbook and a collection of Yeats, its pages soft with handling, passages underlined in her mother's careful script. A lantern does not lose its flame by lighting others, Emma read aloud, her voice carrying across the afternoon quiet to where her mother dozed in the recliner, the gentle breeze moving the curtains in a rhythm that seemed synchronized with Margaret's breathing. The words landed in Emma's chest with the force of recognition, not because they were new, but because they named something she had always known but never had language for. The teaching had emerged from a story about a monastery where the monks grew worried about sharing their wisdom, afraid that giving away their insights would leave them spiritually impoverished. The abbot, wise in the way that comes from decades of watching minds create problems that don't exist, took them to the temple's central lantern, a flame that had burned continuously for 3 centuries. "Watch," he said, and used the ancient flame to light dozens of candles. The original lantern burned as brightly as ever, and the room filled with a warmth that had been waiting in the darkness. Emma closed the book and looked at her mother, seeing for the first time not the burden of care that had been wearing her thin, but the continuation of light that had been moving between them for 47 years. Margaret stirred in her chair, and when she opened her eyes, there was a moment of clarity that had become increasingly rare. "You look tired, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying the same tenderness that had once soothed scraped knees and broken hearts. "I'm okay, Mom," Emma replied. But Margaret's teacher instincts, sharpened by decades of seeing through student excuses, weren't fooled. "Come here," Margaret said, patting the arm of her chair. Emma hesitated. She had lists to update, medications to organize, phone calls to return. But the gentle breeze moved through the room again, and she found herself settling beside her mother's chair, her head resting against the armrest like she used to do as a child when Margaret would read aloud on Sunday afternoons. "You know," Margaret said, her fingers finding Emma's hair with muscle memory that transcended confusion. "I used to worry that loving you and your brother would use up all my love, like it was a finite resource that I had to ration carefully." Her voice carried the wonder of someone discovering something remarkable in a familiar landscape. "But the more I loved you, the more love I seemed to have." It was the strangest economic principle I'd ever encountered. Emma felt tears gathering, not from sadness, but from the relief that comes when someone names the fear you've been carrying without knowing it. In her consulting work, she'd specialized in resource allocation, helping companies maximize efficiency by identifying and eliminating waste. She'd been unconsciously applying the same framework to caregiving, measuring her energy output and worrying about depletion, never considering that love might operate according to different principles than profit margins. The gentle breeze carried with it the sound of children playing in the neighborhood park, their laughter rising and falling like a tide that asks nothing of the shore, but offers everything to it. Emma realized she had been holding her breath for months, as if exhaling fully might somehow drain her of the reserves she needed to keep going. But as she lay beside her mother's chair, feeling Margaret's fingers gentle in her hair, her breath began to deepen without effort, each exhalation making space for a fuller inhale. "I keep thinking I should be doing more," Emma whispered, giving voice to the anxiety that had been her constant companion. Margaret's hand stilled for a moment, and Emma wondered if the confusion had returned. But when her mother spoke, her words carried the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime helping others see what was right in front of them. "Oh, honey," Margaret said, her voice soft with understanding. "You think love is a performance review." The words landed with the precision of a teacher who has just helped a struggling student glimpse the answer that was hidden in plain sight. But love isn't something you do. It's something you are. Emma lifted her head to look at her mother, seeing in Margaret's eyes the woman who had shaped her understanding of dedication and service, but also recognizing how she had inherited her mother's tendency toward perfectionism without absorbing her wisdom about grace. The gentle breeze stirred the pages of the Buddhist book, still open on Emma's lap, and she found herself reading aloud again. Nurture kindness, both outward and within. The phrase created a pause in Emma's internal commentary, that persistent voice that had been running a continuous audit of her caregiving performance. She had been so focused on nurturing kindness outward, toward her mother, toward the healthcare workers, toward the neighbors who asked how she was managing, that she had forgotten the second half of the teaching. The kindness within had been rationed, saved for some mythical future when she would have time for self-compassion. Scientists now know what monks always knew, that compassion activates the same neural pathways whether directed toward others or ourselves, and that the brain doesn't distinguish between the love we give and the love we receive when both arise from the same source. But Emma learned this not from research, but from the laboratory of daily care, where small revelations bloom in the spaces between medication schedules and medical appointments. The transformation began with attention to moments she had previously categorized as interruptions. When her mother forgot the same question she'd asked 10 minutes earlier, Emma noticed her own impatience with curiosity rather than judgment. When Margaret became confused about where she was, instead of rushing to correct her, Emma began sitting with the disorientation, offering presence rather than solutions. The gentle breeze became her reminder to pause, to breathe, to remember that love is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be inhabited. Emma began to notice the way her mother's face softened when she heard her favorite song, how Margaret's hands still moved gracefully when she watered plants, even when she couldn't remember their names. She saw how her mother's eyes lit up when the postal worker stopped to chat, how Margaret saved the good chocolates for Emma even when she forgot she had bought them. These observations weren't new. The moments had always been there. But Emma's relationship to them shifted from seeing caregiving as a series of tasks to experiencing it as a form of meditation, each interaction an opportunity to practice presence. The book became their evening companion, Emma reading aloud while Margaret listened, sometimes following the words, and sometimes drifting in her own contemplation. The stories worked on them both, not through intellectual understanding, but through the slow alchemy of repeated exposure to wisdom that asks nothing more than to be received. Emma learned that her mother had discovered Buddhism during her graduate studies, drawn to its practical approach to suffering and its recognition that trying to avoid difficulty often creates more pain than the original problem. "I never wanted you to have to take care of me," Margaret said one evening as Emma helped her prepare for bed, the words carrying the weight of every parent who watches their independence dissolve despite their best-laid plans. "Mom?" Emma replied, the response emerging from some deeper knowing that had been growing in the spaces between stories and breath. "You're not a burden I'm carrying. You're a light I'm tending." The gentle breeze moved through the open bedroom window, carrying with it the scent of the garden Margaret had planted but could no longer maintain. Emma had hired someone to keep it growing, understanding finally that nurturing doesn't always require our direct hands, but sometimes asks us to create conditions for flourishing. Margaret smiled, the expression carrying recognition of her own words coming back to her through her daughter's voice, the lantern's flame passing between them in the endless circulation of love that asks nothing of its own illumination. As Emma tucked the covers around her mother's shoulders, she felt her own breathing settle into the rhythm that comes when we stop fighting the current and learn to swim with the tide. The day's tasks were complete, but more importantly, the day's opportunities for connection had been met with presence rather than performance anxiety. Emma's shoulders, which had carried the tension of trying to be enough, began to release into the understanding that she already was. Walking to her own room, Emma paused by the window where the gentle breeze had become her teacher, her reminder that care flows most freely when we stop demanding that it look different than it does. The neighborhood was settling into sleep, porch lights creating small pools of warmth in the darkness, each home holding its own stories of love, learning to expand rather than contract in the face of difficulty. Emma pulled the Buddhist book from her bedside table, not to read, but to hold, feeling its weight as a reminder that wisdom is always available when we stop looking for it everywhere, except where we are. The lantern's flame that had lit her mother's understanding was the same light that now illuminated her own path, not because she had earned it through perfect caregiving, but because it had been burning all along, waiting for her to notice that love multiplies through sharing rather than diminishing. As Emma settled into bed, the gentle breeze moved through her room one more time, carrying with it the sound of her mother's peaceful breathing and the quiet settling of a house where two people had learned to tend each other's light without fear of running out of illumination. Her breath deepened into the rhythm of someone who has discovered that rest is not the absence of love, but its natural expression, and that tomorrow's caregiving would emerge not from duty or depletion, but from the endless renewal that comes when we finally understand that the lantern and the flame, the giver and the gift, the mother and the daughter, have always been expressions of the same luminous source. Sleep came not as escape from the day's responsibilities, but as continuation of its grace. Each breath a small prayer of gratitude for the opportunity to learn that love's mathematics operate according to principles that make hearts, like lanterns, brighter with every flame they kindle. And in the morning, Emma would wake not to the burden of another day of caregiving, but to the gift of another day of tending light. Her shoulders soft with the understanding that she had never been carrying her mother's needs, but had always been sharing in love's endless capacity to illuminate whatever darkness asks for healing. May your own breath find this same rhythm of grace, and may the gentle breeze of awareness carry you into dreams where the lantern of your heart burns bright with the knowledge that every act of care adds light to a world hungry for such illumination. The dream came to Brian again on Thursday night. A figure standing at the edge of vision, neither friend nor stranger, holding something that might have been keys or might have been stones. He woke with his feet already moving beneath the sheets, muscles twitching with the need to pace, to outrun whatever truths the darkness was trying to show him. At 59, Brian had perfected the art of motion without progress. His evening walks had become pilgrimages of regret, feet finding familiar paths while his mind traveled the worn grooves of what if and if only. Tonight, as he slipped from bed and into his walking shoes, he whispered to his sleeping wife the same gentle lie. Just getting some air. The neighborhood streets welcomed him with their amber-lit silence. Each footfall on concrete echoed the rhythm of his racing thoughts. You should have taken that promotion, should have been braver, should have spoken up when it mattered. The litany was as familiar as his route, as predictable as the sleeplessness that drove him into the night. But tonight, something shifted in the rhythm. Perhaps it was the way moonlight caught the edge of the community garden, or how the old Buddhist temple at the corner seemed to exhale incense into the cooling air. His feet, usually driven by restless urgency, began to slow. What are you running from? The question arose unbidden, spoken in a voice that sounded like his own but older, more patient. Brian paused at the garden's edge, noticing how the gravel path wound between sleeping plants like a river of possibility. The gate stood slightly ajar, an invitation he'd never noticed in all his hurried passings. Brian found himself stepping through, his feet grateful for the soft crunch of pebbles after miles of unforgiving pavement. Each step released a small sound, like whispered prayers or gentle warnings. In the garden's center, a wooden bench waited beneath an ancient oak. As Brian settled onto its weathered surface, he felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the weight he'd carried since that morning 23 years ago when he'd chosen safety over dreams, practicality over passion. The corporate job instead of the small nonprofit. The secure path instead of the uncertain one that might have changed everything. But who stands guard at the gate of your thoughts? The question drifted through his awareness like incense smoke. Brian closed his eyes, and suddenly he was not alone on the bench. A figure sat beside him, neither young nor old, wearing robes that shifted between shadow and starlight. You've been walking the same path for decades, the figure said, voice carrying the warmth of temple bells. But walking in circles isn't pilgrimage, it's prison. Brian wanted to protest, to explain how he'd had responsibilities, a family to support, practical concerns that didn't allow for idealistic choices. But the words felt hollow in this space between sleep and waking, where honesty became inevitable. I was afraid, he heard himself whisper. Afraid I wasn't good enough, smart enough, brave enough for the life I actually wanted. The figure nodded, reaching into the folds of their robe to produce what looked like a small lantern, though its light seemed to come from within rather than from any flame. Fear makes an excellent gatekeeper, very dedicated, never sleeps, questions everyone. But it only knows one word: no. As the lantern's glow spread through the garden, Brian saw something that made his breath catch. There, walking among the plants, was himself at 36, the man who had stood at that crucial crossroads, briefcase in one hand and dream in the other. The younger Brian moved with purpose, but also with something else, a deep exhaustion, shoulders already bowing under burdens that hadn't even fully formed yet. He was trying so hard to be good, present. Brian murmured, watching his younger self examine each choice with the intensity of a jeweler studying flaws. Good provider, good employee, good son living up to everyone else's definitions of success. Yes, the figure agreed. But what was he avoiding by being so very good? The question hung in the air like temple smoke, and suddenly Brian was back in his childhood home, 8 years old, watching his father come home from another failed business venture. The slump of defeated shoulders, the careful way his mother didn't ask questions, the electricity of disappointment crackling through dinner conversation that stayed deliberately light. I was avoiding becoming him, Brian said, the words emerging from a place deeper than thought. My father, brilliant and passionate and absolutely terrifying in his willingness to risk everything for his dreams. He failed so magnificently, so completely, that success felt like the only rebellion available to me. The robed figure was quiet for a long moment, allowing Brian's confession to settle like seeds in fertile ground. When they spoke again, their voice carried new depths, not judgment, but understanding born of long practice with human pain. So you built your life as evidence against your father's choices. But tell me, what happened to your own dreams in this testimony against his? Brian felt something crack open in his chest, a pain so familiar he'd stopped noticing it years ago. They became the enemy. Every creative impulse, every moment of wanting something different, it all felt like betrayal. Of my family, of common sense, of everyone depending on me to be the steady one. Around them, the garden began to shift. Plants that had seemed dormant in moonlight revealed themselves as quietly growing, roots deep and patient, reaching toward light they trusted would come. Brian watched, transfixed, as his younger self continued moving through the rows, but now he could see what he'd missed before. The way his father's hands had been gentle with broken things, how his eyes had held wonder even in defeat. The legacy of love that had gotten lost in Brian's focus on the failures. The shadow isn't evil, the figure said softly. It's the parts of ourselves we exile because they feel too dangerous to own. But what we resist persists, and what we deny, we repeat. Brian nodded, understanding flooding through him like water through drought-cracked earth. I thought I was avoiding his mistakes, but I was just making different ones. He risked too much. I risked too little. He failed loudly. I succeeded quietly. But we both missed the middle path. As dawn approached, though whether in dream or in the garden, Brian could no longer tell, the figure reached again into their robes, this time producing what looked like a small key made of twisted metal and moonlight. There's an old teaching, they said, placing the key in Brian's palm where it felt both substantial and weightless. The mind is like a house with many rooms, and we station a gatekeeper at the entrance. Most people choose fear as their gatekeeper because fear is vigilant, tireless, absolutely dedicated to keeping unwanted visitors away. Brian felt the key warm against his skin, and suddenly he could see it, the gate of his own mind, where a figure paced endlessly back and forth, challenging every thought, every dream, every moment of spontaneous joy with the same exhausting questions. Is this practical? Is this safe? What will people think? What if you fail? But here's what fear doesn't understand, the figure continued, their voice now sounding remarkably like Brian's own inner wisdom, finally given permission to speak. A gatekeeper who only knows how to say no eventually locks out everything, including peace, including rest, including the very dreams that make life worth living. Brian watched as his fear gatekeeper continued its relentless patrol, and for the first time in decades, he felt not anger at this part of himself, but compassion. This inner guardian had been working so hard, staying awake every night, examining every possibility for danger, trying so desperately to keep him safe. "You've done good work," Brian found himself saying to the fearful gatekeeper. "You kept me fed and housed and secure. You made sure I never risked becoming the kind of spectacular failure that would hurt the people I love. Thank you." The gatekeeper paused in its pacing, turning toward Brian with surprise that slowly softened into relief. For the first time in memory, its shoulders relaxed slightly. "But now," Brian continued, "I need you to learn a new word. Not just no, but also maybe, and gently, and sometimes even yes. Can you do that?" The key in his palm grew warmer, and Brian understood that this was the real work, not banishing the fearful part of himself, but teaching it new skills, expanding its vocabulary beyond pure protection into something that could recognize friend from foe, opportunity from threat, growth from destruction. The robed figure smiled, and Brian noticed that their face had been shifting throughout their conversation, sometimes appearing as his meditation teacher from years ago, sometimes as his grandmother, sometimes as no one he recognized, but everyone he'd ever trusted. "Now comes the practice," they said, and Brian found himself back on the bench, but the garden around them had transformed. The paths were still there, but now they gleamed like silver rivers in the moonlight, winding not in anxious circles, but in spirals that moved both inward and outward, connecting all points to a center that pulsed with quiet light. Each night, when the restless thoughts come, and they will come, because that's what thoughts do, you can practice being the kind of gatekeeper you actually want to be. Not the one who says no to everything, but the one who can tell the difference between visitors worth welcoming and ones that need to be kindly turned away. Brian nodded, feeling his feet finally, truly still against the garden's pebbled ground. He could sense the difference now, the way anxiety-driven thoughts moved with sharp edges and urgent demands, while peaceful thoughts approached with the gentle patience of old friends. So when the mind fills with replaying the day's challenges, the figure continued, or rehearsing tomorrow's worries, or cycling through the endless catalog of past regrets, you can practice saying, "Thank you for visiting, but this is not a good time. Please come back during daylight hours when I'm better equipped to give you proper attention." Brian closed his eyes and felt the truth of this settle into his bones. How many nights had he lain awake entertaining every anxious thought, as if it were an emergency requiring immediate resolution? How many hours of potential rest had he sacrificed to mental visitors who came bearing gifts of suffering disguised as productivity? "And what about the peaceful thoughts?" he asked. "How do I recognize them?" The figure's smile deepened. They're the ones that don't demand immediate action. They arrive quietly, often bearing gifts of perspective or gratitude or simple presence. They're content to sit with you without needing to be solved or fixed or figured out. As if summoned by their conversation, Brian felt his attention drawn to the path beneath his feet. Each pebble seemed to catch and hold the lantern's light, creating a constellation of small illuminations leading deeper into the garden's heart. "Try walking now," the figure suggested. "But this time, let each step be intentional. Let each pebble be a thought you're choosing to release." Brian stood, surprised by how different his legs felt. Still strong, still ready to move, but no longer driven by the desperate need to outrun his own mind. As he took his first step onto the glowing path, he felt something release from his shoulders. The weight of a regret he'd carried for so long. He'd forgotten it wasn't part of his skeleton. Step. I release the voice that says I should have been braver in 1987. Another step. Another small freedom. I release the story that my father's struggles were a prediction of my own. With each footfall, Brian felt layers of accumulated tension melting away. Not disappearing completely, he understood now that some sorrows were meant to be companions rather than enemies, but transforming from sharp-edged burdens into something more like compost, rich with lessons that could nourish new growth. The pebbles beneath his feet seemed to pulse with each release, as if the path itself was designed for this exact purpose. The gentle archaeology of a lifetime's accumulated worries, examined not with harsh judgment, but with the patient compassion of a gardener sorting seeds. Step. I release the belief that security and creativity cannot coexist. Step. I release the fear that it's too late to plant new dreams. Step. I release the exhaustion of carrying everyone else's definitions of success. With each release, Brian felt his gatekeeper learning new skills: how to hold space for multiple truths, how to distinguish between wisdom gained through experience and trauma frozen in repetition, how to welcome the parts of his father's legacy that had been hidden beneath the scar tissue of old disappointments. By the time Brian reached the path's end, a small clearing where a fountain whispered secrets to the stars, he felt fundamentally different. Not fixed, not suddenly perfect, but aligned in a way that reminded him of tuning a guitar. The same instrument, but now capable of making music instead of noise. The robed figure had followed, their presence now feeling less like a separate person and more like his own deepest wisdom finally given voice and permission to guide. The work isn't finished, they said, settling beside the fountain where koi fish moved like liquid thoughts through moon-silvered water. This is practice, not perfection. Some nights, the old gatekeeper will forget its new training and fall back into familiar patterns. Some nights, you'll find yourself walking anxious circles despite everything you've learned tonight. Brian nodded, understanding this wasn't a cure, but a path. One that would require daily tending, like the garden around them. But now you know the difference, the figure continued. Between walking that serves movement towards something and walking that's just fear wearing down your souls. Between thoughts that deserve a seat at your inner table and ones that are better served with gentle boundaries. As the fountain sang its liquid lullaby, Brian felt his eyelids growing heavy for the first time in months. Not the exhaustion of defeat, but the deep tiredness that comes after meaningful work. The way a gardener feels at day's end. Muscles pleasantly spent. Hands dirty with earth that will soon sprout new life. "It's time," the figure said, and Brian understood they meant time to return. To his bed, to his wife, to his waking life, but carrying with him everything he'd discovered in this space between worlds. As he walked back through the garden, Brian noticed how different the path felt beneath his feet. The pebbles that had seemed sharp with urgency on his arrival now felt smooth, worn gentle by countless other pilgrims who had walked this way before him. Each step was no longer flight, but return. To the present moment, to his body, to the bed where his wife slept peacefully, trusting that he would find his way back to her and to rest. Standing at the garden's gate, Brian turned for one last look at the figure who had been his guide. But already they were fading, becoming part of shadow and starlight, part of the garden itself. Before they disappeared completely, they spoke one final time. "Remember, the gatekeeper you choose shapes the dreams you're allowed to dream. Choose well." Brian nodded, pocketing the key that had become solid and real in his hand, and stepped back onto the familiar sidewalk. But even the concrete felt different now. Not harsh, but supportive, part of the path that led home. Back in his bedroom, Brian slipped beneath covers that welcomed him like an old friend's embrace. His wife stirred slightly, unconsciously reaching for him with the trust of 30 years together. And he felt a wave of gratitude so profound, it nearly brought tears. As he settled into the mattress, Brian felt his newly trained gatekeeper taking its position, not at the door like a bouncer checking IDs, but more like a wise host at a dinner party, capable of welcoming the right guests while kindly redirecting others to more appropriate venues. The anxious thoughts came, as they always did. Tomorrow's meetings, next month's challenges, the endless catalog of things that could go wrong or needed fixing. But now, instead of entertaining each worry as an honored guest, Brian found himself speaking to them with gentle firmness. "Thank you for your concern, but this is not the time for planning. Sleep is for rest and dreams, and the kind of deep restoration that makes tomorrow's challenges actually manageable. Please come back during business hours when I can give you proper attention." To his amazement, the thoughts didn't fight back. They seemed almost relieved to be given clear boundaries, like children who act out until someone provides the structure they've been secretly craving. In their place came other visitors, memories of his daughter's laugh, the feeling of soil between his fingers during weekend gardening, the taste of his wife's perfect coffee, the way afternoon light slanted through their kitchen window. Thoughts that didn't demand action, but simply offered presence, like old friends content to sit together in comfortable silence. Brian's muscles began to uncoil for the first time in months, each group releasing its held tension like flowers opening to morning sun. His feet, finally still, rested heavy and grateful against the mattress. The racing thoughts that had driven his nightly pilgrimages slowed to a gentle walk, then to stillness. As sleep approached, real sleep, restorative and deep, Brian felt himself drifting not into unconsciousness, but into a different kind of awareness. The key from his dream had become real somehow, warm in his palm, and he. For my grandmother, Mei Lin, who taught me that wisdom travels in soup steam and bedtime stories. The photograph sits on my nightstand, 3 generations of women, all sharing the same worried furrow between our brows. Grandmother Mei Lin in the center, her weathered hands folded over her apron. My mother Sara to her right, with paint-stained fingers from her art studio. And me at 41, holding my new employment contract like it might bite me. 3 women, 3 generations of the same late-night pacing, the same tendency to meet change with a clenched jaw and racing heart. But tonight, as I stare at Shannon's story, this young woman lying awake, terrified of tomorrow's new job, I smell something that wasn't in the photograph. The ghost of my grandmother's kitchen, star anise and compassion simmering together. Mei Lin came to America carrying nothing but a cloth bag of Buddhist stories and an unshakable belief that every pot of soup was an opportunity to feed both hunger and worry. She never called herself a teacher, never spoke of dharma or noble truths. She simply stirred and listened, stirred and shared, until the kitchen became a temple and bedtime became a practice of letting go. "Ayah, little one," she would say when I'd burst through her door with some fresh catastrophe. A failed test, a broken friendship, a future that seemed too big for my small hands. "Come. The soup knows what to do with troubles." I never understood what she meant until I became the grandmother myself. Watching my own granddaughter Lily arrive last week with tears streaming, convinced she'd ruined everything by choosing the wrong college major. "Nai," she sobbed, using Mei Lin's old name for me. "I can't sleep. I keep thinking I made the wrong choice. What if I'm not ready? What if I fail?" And there it was, the same voice that had kept me awake at 21, at 35, at 41 when I held that job contract with trembling hands. The voice that still visits Shannon now, whispering that tomorrow will demand more than she has to give. That night with Lily, I found myself moving toward the stove the way Mei Lin used to, pulled by muscle memory older than my conscious mind. My hands reached for the star anise, the ginger, the same clay pot that had survived 3 generations of midnight worry sessions. "Tell me," I said, beginning to chop vegetables with the rhythm Mei Lin had taught me. Steady, present, no rushing toward the future. "What does ready feel like to you?" Lily perched on the same stool where I'd sat decades earlier, watching Mei Lin transform simple ingredients into something nourishing. Like I should have all the answers already. Like everyone else knows something I don't. I smiled, remembering Shannon's story, remembering my own sleepless night before that job change. "Your great-great-grandmother Mei Lin used to say something about ships. She'd tell me, 'Even the strongest vessels must return to harbor. Not because they are broken, but because wisdom knows when to rest.'" The soup began to simmer, releasing that familiar fragrance of home and healing. Lily's shoulders started to drop, the way mine always did in this kitchen, in the presence of this particular alchemy. She would tell me stories, I continued, stirring slowly, about a young woman, always a young woman, though the details changed with my age, who lay awake before a great journey. Second-guessing, she refrains from sleeping in fear she is unready. Mei Lin would say in her careful English, the words formal but the voice tender as steam. Lily leaned forward, drawn into the rhythm of story the way children always are. What happened to her? Ah, that was Mei Lin's gift. She never rushed to the ending. She would let the soup teach first. Mei Lin believed that wisdom lived at the spaces between words, in the pause between question and answer, in the time it takes for broth to find its depth. She would stir and speak in fragments, letting the story simmer alongside our dinner. This young woman, she'd continue, ladling soup into my bowl. She thinks readiness means having no fear. But the old teachers, they knew different. They knew that even sturdy ships pause for repair. True readiness dawns only from making time to rest. I remember being frustrated by these broken teachings, wanting the clear moral, the simple instruction. But Mei Lin would just smile and add more vegetables to my bowl. Eat first, she'd say. Wisdom needs a full belly. It wasn't until years later, sitting in graduate school studying Buddhist philosophy, or in meditation retreats learning about impermanence, or in my own therapy training understanding trauma-informed care, that I realized Mei Lin had been offering me the complete Dharma all along. She simply served it one spoonful at a time, seasoned with love and patience. The ship metaphor became family scripture. When I lay awake at 18, terrified of leaving for college, Mei Lin would sit on the edge of my bed and whisper, "Ships return to harbor not as defeat, but as wisdom. Rest is how we prepare for the deep waters." When my mother struggled with her art, convinced she was too old to change her style, Mei Lin would bring her tea and say, "Even the master painters clean their brushes. The canvas waits with love, not judgment." And when I faced my own version of Shannon's story, that new job at 41, the contract that represented everything I thought I wanted but felt too small to deserve, Mei Lin, though nearly 90 then, still knew exactly what to offer. I can still feel the texture of that employment contract between my fingers. Thick paper that crackled with possibility and terror in equal measure. The position was everything I'd worked toward. Directing a new mindfulness program at the Children's Hospital, combining my Buddhist studies with trauma-sensitive care, finally bridging the gap between Mei Lin's kitchen wisdom and my formal training. But lying in bed that night, I felt exactly like Shannon, caught between the desire to embrace this new chapter and the overwhelming certainty that I wasn't ready. The familiar spiral of second-guessing began. Was I too old to start over? Did I have enough experience? What if I failed publicly, professionally, permanently? Sleep felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, tomorrow loomed larger, more demanding, less forgiving. At 2 a.m., I gave up pretending and drove to Mei Lin's apartment. She met me at the door as if she'd been expecting me, wearing her old blue robe and the expression of someone who had weathered countless storms of the heart. "Come," she said simply. "The soup knows what to do with troubles." Even at 90, she moved around her kitchen with the grace of someone who had found her dharma in the everyday sacred. I watched her hands, spotted now with age but steady in their purpose, reach for the familiar ingredients. "Tell me," she said, beginning our ritual. "I'm not ready," I whispered. and in saying it felt exactly like the scared girl who had sat on this same stool for decades. I'm 41, and I feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. Mei Lin nodded, stirring slowly. The young woman in the story, she said. She thinks being ready means having no doubt. But the Buddha, he knew different. He knew that doubt is just another visitor. We don't have to feed it dinner, but we don't have to slam the door either. She ladled soup into 2 bowls, the ritual as familiar as breathing. Sit with me, little one. Let me tell you what the ship knows about coming home. We sat at her small kitchen table, the same one where she'd fed 3 generations of worry and hope. Mei Lin's hands wrapped around her bowl, and I saw in them all the storms she'd weathered. Leaving her homeland, losing her husband young, raising children in a language that never quite felt like home, watching her daughter struggle with art and confidence, shepherding me through my own decades of uncertainty. The ship metaphor, she began. I learned this from my own grandmother in China, but I think I never told you the complete story. I leaned forward, realizing that even after all these years, Mei Lin still had teachings to share. There was a merchant ship, she said, that sailed the same route for many years. The captain knew every current, every dangerous reef, every safe harbor. But one day, the ocean offered him a new route, shorter, more profitable, but through waters he had never traveled. She paused to sip her soup, letting the story settle. The night before this new journey, the captain could not sleep. He walked the deck, checking and rechecking his instruments, his maps, his supplies. His crew watched him pace and began to worry. If their experienced captain was afraid, surely they were doomed. I smiled, recognizing myself in this captain, recognizing Shannon, recognizing every person who had ever stood on the edge of change and felt suddenly, completely unprepared. But then, Mei Lin continued, the ship's oldest sailor approached the captain. Sir, he said, you are trying to be ready for waters you have never sailed? But readiness is not about knowing the destination. Readiness is about trusting the vessel. She reached across the table and took my hand. You are the vessel, little one. All your years of study, all your meditation practice, all your work with children and families, this is not preparation for readiness. This is readiness. The ship does not doubt its ability to float. It simply enters the water and becomes what it was built to be. Something shifted in me as Mei Lin spoke, the way it always did in her presence. The tight knot of anxiety that had been living in my chest for weeks began to soften, not disappearing, but loosening its grip. The teaching says, she continued, now quoting the words that would later become part of my own bedtime practice. Teachings say even sturdy ships pause for repair. True readiness dawns only from making time to rest. You are not broken, needing repair. You are wise, taking time to rest. We finished our soup in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of shared worry and weathered storms. Mei Lin's apartment felt like a harbor itself, warm, protected, a place where ships could anchor before venturing into deeper waters. Will you stay the night? She asked, though we both knew I would. I want to share with you the bedtime practice my grandmother taught me, the one I gave you as a child, but maybe now you can receive it differently. I nodded, feeling suddenly young again, but in the best way. Not inexperienced, but open, not unprepared, but willing to learn. Mei Lin led me to the guest room, the same room where I'd slept countless times as a child, during storms both literal and metaphorical. She tucked me in with the same care she'd shown when I was 7, but spoke to me with the respect due a fellow traveler. "Close your eyes," she said softly. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you." Mei Lin's voice in the darkness carried the weight of decades, the authority of someone who had watched me grow from worried child to worried adult and loved me completely through every transformation. I see a woman who learned to meditate not just in cushioned silence, but in the chaos of her own doubt. I see someone who studied Buddhist philosophy and then had the wisdom to return to the kitchen where Dharma lives in everyday kindness. Her words settled over me like a warm blanket, and I felt my body beginning to relax for the first time in weeks. I see a woman who chose to work with children not because it was easy, but because she remembered what it felt like to be small and afraid. I see someone who turned her own healing into a gift for others. The practice Mei Lin offered that night became the foundation of everything I would later share with my own clients, with my granddaughter Lily, with every Shannon who has sat in my office carrying tomorrow's fears like stones in her pockets. "Float like a ship meeting dawn," Mei Lin whispered, "safe in this inward harbor. Feel your body held by this bed the way water holds a vessel. You are not sinking. You are not drifting. You are exactly where you need to be, resting before the next adventure." As she spoke, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, the complete trust that someone else was watching over my worry, that I could let go and still be safe. Your breath is the gentle current that rocks you toward peace. Your heartbeat is the ancient rhythm that has carried your ancestors through countless storms. You are not separate from their courage. You carry it in your bones. I must have slept, because the next thing I remember is waking to the smell of Mei Lin's breakfast congee and the sound of her humming an old Chinese lullaby. But more than that, I woke with a fundamental shift in my relationship to the unknown. The new job was still new, still uncertain, but I was no longer afraid of my own readiness. That morning marked the beginning of a different way of meeting change, not just for me, but for the generations that would follow. When I started my position at the Children's Hospital, I brought Mei Lin's soup wisdom with me, translating her kitchen dharma into trauma-sensitive mindfulness practices. I began offering bedtime meditation sessions for families dealing with medical crises, teaching parents how to create harbor spaces for their frightened children. Mei Lin's ship metaphor became central to my work, helping people understand that rest is not procrastination, but preparation, that floating is not giving up, but trusting the process. Years later, when Lily sat in my kitchen with her own college fears, I realized we had the opportunity to transform a family pattern. Where Mei Lin had soothed my worry, and I had eventually found my way to peace. Perhaps Lily could learn to meet uncertainty with curiosity rather than dread. "Tell me about this ship practice," Lily said as we finished our soup. The same recipe, the same rhythm, but a new generation learning to navigate change. I smiled, hearing Mei Lin's voice in my own words. "Close your eyes and imagine you are a captain who has been sailing for years. You know your vessel. you trust your crew. Tomorrow offers new waters, but tonight you are safe in harbor. As I guided Lily through the practice Mei Lin had given me, I felt the presence of all the women who had worried before us, all the ones who would worry after us, connected by the thread of love that transforms anxiety into wisdom. Float like a ship meeting dawn, I whispered, the words carrying the weight of 3 generations of bedtime blessings, safe in this inward harbor. Now, as I write Shannon's story, I understand that we are all learning the same lesson across time and circumstance. The details change: new jobs, college choices, career transitions, family challenges, but the invitation remains constant: to find the harbor within ourselves where we can rest before we sail. Mei Lin has been gone for 5 years now, but her kitchen wisdom continues to nourish. Last week, Lily called me from her dorm room, excited to share that she had taught her worried roommate the ship practice. "Nai Nai," she said. I told her what great Nai Nai used to say about sturdy ships pausing for repair, and something just clicked for her. This is how healing travels through generations, not as heavy inheritance of trauma, but as practical wisdom offered with love. Mei Lin's immigrant grandmother passed her the ship metaphor during China's upheavals. Mei Lin carried it to America and seasoned it with kitchen kindness. I translated it through my training and professional practice. Lily is now sharing it with her peers, the ancient teaching finding new forms for contemporary fears. Shannon's story reminds me that at any age, in any century, the human heart faces the same fundamental challenge: how to meet the unknown with courage rather than terror, how to trust our readiness even when we cannot see the destination clearly. The answer, I believe, lies not in becoming fearless, but in learning to rest skillfully, to create harbor spaces in our daily lives where we can anchor safely before the next adventure. To remember that readiness is not about having all the answers, but about trusting the vessel we have become through all our previous journeys. As I prepare for sleep myself, I practice what Mei Lin taught me, what I have shared with countless others, what Lily now carries forward. The understanding that tomorrow's challenges are met not through tonight's worry, but through tonight's rest. I close my eyes and feel my grandmother's presence, not as memory, but as living wisdom. Her voice whispers across time. Even sturdy ships pause for repair. True readiness dawns only from making time to rest. My body settles into the familiar rhythm of the practice, breath by breath releasing the day's accumulated tension. I am no longer the 41-year-old woman terrified of her new job, though I carry her experience with compassion. I am no longer the child seeking Mei Lin's midnight comfort, though I treasure those moments of being completely held. I am the woman I have become through all those moments of choosing rest over worry, trust over terror, harbor over endless drifting and anxious seas. I am the grandmother now, holding space for Lily's fears and Shannon's story, and every person who lies awake. The monastery bells have fallen silent. In the gathering dusk, an old teacher sits one last time with those who have journeyed far to reach this moment of completion. The wind carries the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of water flowing toward the sea. Linda, 36, sits at the mountain's base in the pre-dawn darkness, her breath visible in small clouds that dissolve into the vastness above. Recent losses disturb her nights. Sadness echoes heavily in silence. Yet something has shifted in these sacred hours. The mountain before her, ancient, weathered, eternal, seems to pulse with the rhythm of her own heart. A mountain weathers sun and storm, she whispers, remembering words that have carried her through 5 profound encounters with wisdom. The heart bears joy and grief just as bravely. As she speaks, the stories begin to weave themselves around her like prayer flags in the wind. She sees Marcus, 45, standing in his empty house after divorce, learning that even in solitude, the song of self-love can begin. His journey from the darkness of separation to the light of self-discovery flows through her awareness like a river joining the ocean. The mountain seems to nod, and Linda recalls Sara, 29, trembling in her first job interview, discovering that vulnerability is not weakness, but the gateway to authentic connection. The bridge Sara learned to build between fear and courage now spans the valley of Linda's own uncertainty, showing her that every ending is also a beginning. In the growing light, she remembers David, 52, walking through the forest of his financial ruin, gathering wisdom like fallen leaves. His transformation from panic to presence, from scarcity to abundance of spirit, reminds Linda that loss often clears the ground for new growth. The trees seem to rustle with his discovery that true wealth cannot be counted in numbers, but in moments of grace. Most tenderly, she recalls Elena, 41, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, learning that love transcends physical presence. The circle of care Elena wove around her dying mother now encompasses Linda too, teaching her that grief is love persisting, that saying goodbye is sometimes the most profound way of saying hello to what endures. These 4 teachers, Marcus with his song of solitude, Sara with her bridge of courage, David with his forest of wisdom, Elena with her circle of eternal love, gather around Linda like bodhisattvas, each offering their gift to her mountain meditation. But now Linda faces her own ultimate teaching. The recent losses that disturb her nights are not just endings, but invitations. Her marriage of 12 years, dissolved not in anger, but in the sad recognition that 2 good people can grow in different directions. Her career in architecture, abandoned not in failure, but in the realization that she must build something different with her life. Her childhood home, sold after her father's death, taking with it the familiar rooms where her identity was first formed. "I am unraveling," she whispers to the mountain, and in the whisper is both terror and wonder. The mountain receives her words like a temple receives prayers. In the growing light, Linda begins to see what the mountain has always known, that weathering is not destruction, but sculpting. Every storm that has touched this ancient stone has carved it into greater beauty. Every season of sun and snow has revealed new facets of its essential nature. Linda gives space to sorrow, and in that spaciousness, something miraculous occurs. The sorrow does not disappear. Mountains do not hide from weather, but it transforms. Like winter snow that becomes spring rivers, her grief begins to flow towards something life-giving. Sorrow softens, replaced with hope within stillness. She understands now why she has been drawn to this mountain through 5 profound encounters with wisdom. Each story, each teacher, each transformation has been preparing her for this moment of ultimate letting go. Not the small letting go of individual fears or losses, but the great letting go that allows life to live itself through us without our desperate interference. Marcus taught her that solitude can be holy ground. Sara showed her that fear faced becomes courage. David revealed that loss can birth wisdom. Elena demonstrated that love transcends every boundary. And now the mountain offers the final teaching, that we ourselves are not separate from the eternal process of weathering and becoming. As the sun crests the mountain's peak, Linda feels the truth settle into her bones like warm light. She is not Linda, 36, grieving unexpected change. She is the space in which Linda appears, the awareness in which grief and joy dance together, the mountain stillness that remains unchanging while all weather passes through. The 5 stories converge into a single understanding. We are not the storms that shake us or the sunshine that warms us. We are the vast sky in which all weather appears and disappears. We are the mountain heart that weathers everything with equal grace. In this recognition, Linda's midnight restlessness begins its transformation into dawn acceptance, and acceptance prepares to bloom into the peaceful completion that awaits beyond the mountain's embrace. In 50 years of meditation practice and 30 years of guiding others through the valley of grief, I have witnessed the profound architecture of transformation. These 5 stories, Marcus finding love in solitude, Sara building bridges from fear to courage, David discovering abundance in loss, Elena weaving circles of eternal love, and Linda weathering all storms with mountain heart, form what Tibetan teachers call a mandala, a sacred pattern that reveals the deepest structures of awakening. At the center of this mandala lies the golden thread of mindfulness, the awareness that remains present and compassionate regardless of what arises in experience. Each story demonstrates a different facet of this central gem. Marcus discovers mindful solitude, the profound rest that comes when we stop fleeing from our own company. Sara practices mindful courage, the willingness to feel fear fully while acting from wisdom rather than reactivity. David embodies mindful abundance, the recognition that presence itself is the wealth we have been seeking. Elena offers mindful love, the understanding that the heart's true nature transcends physical boundaries. And Linda, our final teacher, demonstrates mindful impermanence, the deepest teaching of all Buddhist wisdom. She shows us that we need not be destroyed by change, but can learn to dance with it, to weather it like mountains weather storms. With patience and grace and an ultimate unshakability that comes not from avoiding difficulty, but from discovering what in us is deeper than any difficulty. From the neuroscience perspective that has enriched my recent years of study, these stories work by engaging what researchers call memory reconsolidation. Each narrative activates the brain's meaning-making networks, while simultaneously soothing the amygdala's alarm responses. The repetitive, rhythmic quality of the storytelling engages the parasympathetic nervous system, shifting us from states of chronic activation toward the restorative rest that makes healing possible. But the Buddha's genius, evident in these progressive teachings, goes deeper than neuroscience can measure. He understood that the human heart learns not through abstract concepts, but through identification with others who have walked similar paths. When we hear Marcus singing to himself in his empty house, something in us recognizes both his loneliness and his courage. When we watch Sara's hands shake before her interview, we remember our own trembling and the strength we found despite it. The historical Buddha taught through what he called gradual instruction, step-by-step guidance that meets students exactly where they are while pointing toward ever deeper understanding. These 5 stories follow this ancient pattern, beginning with the immediate and personal, Marcus's divorce, Sara's job interview, and moving toward the universal and transcendent, Elena's encounter with death, Linda's recognition of impermanence. Each story also serves as what contemplative psychology calls a corrective emotional experience. For those carrying midlife regrets about past choices, Marcus models how to begin again with self-compassion. For those paralyzed by fear of the unknown, Sara demonstrates that we can act courageously while still feeling afraid. For those overwhelmed by material losses, David reveals the abundance that cannot be taken away. For those terrified of saying goodbye, Elena shows how love transcends every ending. In my own journey from a young seeker to this old man preparing for death, I have lived through versions of all these stories. I have known Marcus's solitude in the hermitage years, Sara's fear before my first teaching, David's loss when the monastery nearly failed, Elena's vigil as I have sat with countless dying friends. And now, like Linda, I face the ultimate letting go with a heart that has learned to weather all storms with mountain stillness. This is why these stories form a mandala. They reveal the complete pattern of human awakening. Fear transformed into courage, loneliness into self-love, loss into wisdom, endings into beginnings, and finally, the recognition that we are not separate from the eternal process of change, but are expressions of the very awareness in which all change appears. The mandala is complete. The teaching is whole. Now we turn toward the final practice, allowing this understanding to carry us into the deepest rest, where healing dreams can weave together everything we have received into the fabric of a transformed life. Settle now into your most comfortable position. Feel steady. Let mountain strength rock you gently towards sleep. The journey we have taken together through 5 sacred stories has prepared you for this deepest rest, where integration occurs, not through effort, but through the natural wisdom of a body and mind, ready to receive healing. Begin by bringing to awareness your breath, that faithful companion that has carried you through every moment of your life. Notice how it flows without your control, like streams flowing down the mountain toward the sea. With each exhale, allow yourself to release a little more into this moment. With each inhale, draw in the mountain's ancient peace. Now invite into your awareness the presence of Marcus, our teacher of solitude. Feel in your own body the strength he discovered in learning to be alone without being lonely. As you breathe, imagine his gentle song beginning to hum through your nervous system, a lullaby of self-acceptance that soothes every part of you that has felt abandoned or rejected. Let this song flow through your chest, your shoulders, your arms, carrying the message. You are worthy of your own love. You are enough, exactly as you are. With your next breath, welcome Sara, our bridge builder between fear and courage. Feel in your muscles and bones the truth she discovered, that we can act wisely even while feeling afraid. As her presence settles around you, notice any places in your body where fear is held. Tight shoulders, clenched jaw, shallow breathing. And breathe into these places the courage Sara found. You don't need to eliminate fear. You need only to let courage be present alongside it, like two friends walking together across the bridge of your experience. Breathing deeper now, invite David to join this circle of healing. Feel his forest wisdom beginning to permeate your awareness, the abundance he discovered that no economic collapse could touch. As his presence flows through your body, notice the wealth that is always available, the miracle of breath, the gift of consciousness, the extraordinary fact that you exist at all in this vast universe. Let this recognition of true abundance relax every cell, every fiber, every worry about having enough or being enough. With tender care, now welcome Elena, our teacher of love that transcends boundaries. Feel her circle of compassion encompassing not only you, but everyone you have loved, everyone you have lost, everyone who has shaped your journey. As her loving kindness flows through your being, notice how it heals the places where grief has lived. You need not forget your losses. Instead, let Elena teach you how love continues beyond every ending, how the heart expands to hold both sorrow and joy with equal grace. And now, as all four teachers surround you with their gifts, invite Linda to complete the circle. Feel the mountain heart she discovered becoming your own mountain heart, the stillness that can weather any storm. Like Linda, you are learning that you are not the changing weather of emotions and circumstances, but the vast awareness in which all weather appears. You are the mountain, ancient and patient, and ultimately unshakable. Begin now to scan through your body with mountain heart awareness, starting with the crown of your head. Feel the mountain's peak blessing your thoughts, transforming worry into wisdom, regret into acceptance. Let this blessing flow down through your forehead, releasing the furrows of concern, the tension of trying to figure everything out. Your mountain mind is vast and spacious, with room for all thoughts and feelings to arise and pass away naturally. The blessing flows now through your eyes, which have seen so much sorrow and beauty. Like the mountain that watches countless sunrises and sunsets with equal serenity, your eyes can rest now in the peace of having witnessed life fully. The mountain's wisdom flows through your cheeks, your jaw, releasing years of held words, unexpressed emotions, the exhaustion of carrying too much for too long. Feel the mountain's strength moving into your neck and shoulders, those faithful bearers of burden. Like David learning that his worth was not measured by what he could carry, let your shoulders discover the relief of setting down loads that were never yours to bear. The mountain supports itself not through effort, but through deep rootedness in the earth's patient love. As the mountain heart blessing flows into your chest, feel it surrounding your heart with the same eternal strength that has weathered countless storms. Your heart, like Linda's, is learning that it can hold both grief and joy, fear and courage, endings and beginnings. There is room in your mountain heart for everything you have experienced, and this vastness is not emptiness, but fullness beyond measure. The blessing moves into your arms, those reaching parts of you that have sought to grasp and achieve and hold on to what cannot be held. Like Marcus's arms learning to embrace solitude, let your arms discover the peace of reaching, not for what is absent, but for what is always present. This breath, this moment, this inexplicable gift of being alive. Feel the mountain's deep stability flowing into your core, your belly, the place where fear and excitement both live. Here, where Sara felt her interview nerves, let the mountain teach you that you can feel everything without being overwhelmed by anything. Your center is as stable as stone, as fluid as water, as constant as breath. The blessing flows now into your hips and pelvis, the foundation that carries you through the world. Like Elena sitting vigil beside her mother's bed, let this foundation remind you that love supports you even when everything else seems uncertain. You are held by forces deeper than you can understand, carried by currents of compassion that flow from the mountain's heart to yours. As the mountain heart awareness moves into your legs, feel them releasing the need to run from difficulty or chase after happiness. Your legs can rest now in the knowledge that everywhere you need to go, you have already arrived. Every step of your journey has been bringing you to this moment of perfect rest. Finally, feel the blessing flowing into your feet, which have carried you so faithfully through every day of your life. Like the mountain's deep roots in the earth, let your feet remind you that you belong here, that you are not separate from the earth that holds you or the sky that surrounds you. Now, breathing with your whole mountain heart body, begin to visualize yourself sitting exactly where Linda sits, at the base of the great mountain in the pre-dawn light. Around you, the four teachers form a circle of protection and blessing. Marcus hums his song of self-love. Sara extends the bridge of courage. David offers the abundance of presence. Elena wraps you in the circle of eternal love. As you sit in this sacred circle, begin to see rising from the mountain's peak a gentle light, soft as dawn, warm as spring sunshine. This light carries within it the healing of every wound, the answer to every question, the peace that surpasses understanding. It rises slowly, like a sun made of pure compassion, and begins to descend toward where you sit. As this healing light touches the crown of your head, feel it carrying away every regret about past choices, every worry about future outcomes. You are exactly where you need to be, having learned exactly what you needed to learn. The light flows down through your entire being, illuminating places that have been dark with sorrow, warming places that have been cold with fear. This is the light of your own true nature, the mountain heart awareness that has been present through every experience of your life. It has been there in your struggles and your celebrations, your losses and your discoveries. It is there now, holding you with the same steady love that mountains offer to every storm. As this recognition settles into your bones, begin to hear in the distance the gentle sound of wind chimes, 5 sets of chimes representing the 5 stories that have brought you to this moment of completion. Let their music weave together into a lullaby of integration, a song that speaks to every part of you that has felt fragmented or lost. The chimes sing of Marcus's solitude becoming sacred space, They sing of Sara's fear transforming into courage. They sing of David's loss revealing abundance. They sing of Elena's goodbye becoming eternal love. And they sing of Linda's mountain heart, weathering all storms with grace. As you listen to this music of integration, feel your breathing naturally slowing, deepening, matching the rhythm of the mountain's eternal presence. Each breath carries you deeper into rest, deeper into healing, deeper into the peace that has been waiting for you beneath every struggle. Now, as the wind chimes begin to fade into gentle silence, prepare to receive the final blessing of complete rest. In a moment, I will count backwards from 10 to 1, and with each number, you will sink deeper into the mountain's healing embrace, deeper into the sleep that restores and renews. 10. Feel yourself sinking into the mountain's eternal rest, supported by stone that has weathered millions of years of storms and seasons. You are held by this same unshakable peace. 9. Let go of the need to understand everything that has brought you to this.